During parent-teacher night, my daughter introduced her stepdad as my real dad and me as my mom's ex. I shook the teacher's hand and left quietly. That week, her braces payment bounced and her summer camp got canceled. Now my ex showed up crying. I, 42M, thought I'd seen the worst of divorce drama until last Tuesday night changed everything. My daughter Emma is 13, and I've been the primary financial provider since my ex-wife and I split 3 years ago. She remarried quickly to some finance bro who drives a leased BMW and talks about crypto investments at every family gathering I'm unfortunate enough to attend. The custody arrangement gives me every other weekend and Wednesday dinners, but I've been paying for everything that matters. School supplies, medical bills, extracurriculars, you name it. My ex claimed her new husband would help with expenses, but somehow every invoice still lands in my mailbox. I never complained because Emma deserved stability, and I could handle the financial burden. Parent-teacher night at Jefferson Middle School was supposed to be routine. I'd been attending these meetings since Emma started kindergarten, sitting through presentations about reading levels and math standards. Mrs. Henderson, Emma's homeroom teacher, had requested meetings with both parents to discuss Emma's academic progress and some behavioral concerns she'd been having. I arrived 15 minutes early, as usual, and waited in the hallway outside the classroom. The familiar smell of industrial cleaner and childhood memories filled the air as other parents filed past, some looking stressed, others checking phones. I reviewed my mental notes about Emma's recent grades and prepared to discuss her college prep timeline, even though she was still in middle school. My ex-wife arrived with her husband, and Emma bounced between them like she was walking a red carpet. I watched from my plastic chair as they approached Mrs. Henderson's door, noting how Emma grabbed her stepfather's arm possessively. Something felt different about her behavior, more performative than usual, but I chalked it up to typical teenage drama. Mrs. Henderson called us in together, which should have been my first warning sign. Emma immediately positioned herself between her mother and stepfather, creating a clear visual divide in the small classroom. The teacher began discussing Emma's academic performance, which had been declining recently, particularly in mathematics and science. Then Emma interrupted the conversation to make introductions, and my world shifted on its axis. She gestured toward her stepfather with a bright smile and explained that this was her real dad, the one who really mattered in her life. She then pointed at me with considerably less enthusiasm and introduced me as her mom's ex-husband, someone who used to be around but wasn't really important anymore. The words hit me like physical blows. 3 years of dance recitals, soccer games, midnight emergency room visits, and homework struggles apparently meant nothing. I felt my face flush hot, then cold, as Mrs. Henderson looked between us with obvious confusion. She glanced down at her paperwork, clearly trying to reconcile what Emma was saying with the emergency contact information and financial responsibility forms I'd filled out. My ex-wife's face went pale, and she started to say something, probably to correct Emma's introduction, but I held up my hand to stop her. The damage was done, and making a scene wouldn't help anyone, especially not Emma. Her stepfather looked uncomfortable, but didn't correct the introduction either, which told me everything I needed to know about his character. Mrs. Henderson recovered her composure and continued with the meeting, discussing Emma's grades and social development. Emma had been struggling with peer relationships and showing signs of attention-seeking behavior in class. The teacher recommended some additional tutoring support and suggested family counseling to help with the transition issues that often accompany blended families. I listened politely, asked appropriate questions about Emma's academic needs, and took notes on my phone about the tutoring recommendations. When Mrs. Henderson finished her presentation, I shook her hand, thanked her for her time, and told her I'd be in touch about the tutoring options. Then I walked out of that classroom with my dignity intact and my heart completely shattered. The drive home gave me 2 hours to think, and by the time I reached my apartment, I'd made several decisions that would change everything. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I reviewed 3 years of financial records, payment confirmations, and legal documents. The numbers were staggering, even to me. Emma's private school tuition, $18,000 annually. Orthodontic treatment, $6,500 total, with monthly payments of $200. Summer camp at Lake Winnipesaukee, $3,200 for 6 weeks. Dance lessons, soccer league fees, clothing allowances, medical insurance premiums, and countless other expenses I'd absorbed without question because I thought I was supporting my daughter's future. But apparently, I wasn't her father anymore. I was just her mother's ex-husband, someone who used to matter but didn't anymore. If that's how Emma truly felt, then perhaps it was time to adjust my financial contributions accordingly. The next morning, I called my lawyer and scheduled an emergency appointment. I explained the situation and asked about modifying the support arrangements based on Emma's clear preference for her stepfather's involvement. My lawyer reminded me about my legal obligations, but also explained that voluntary support beyond what was court-ordered could be discontinued at any time. I spent that afternoon making phone calls that should have been difficult but felt surprisingly liberating. The orthodontist's office was first. I explained that I would no longer be responsible for payments and provided my ex-wife's contact information for future billing. The receptionist seemed confused, mentioning that the account was several months behind already, but I explained that billing questions should be directed to the custodial parent. The summer camp conversation was more complicated. Emma had been attending Camp Wildwood for 3 years, and they knew me as the parent who handled registration and payments. I explained that there had been family changes and I would no longer be financially responsible. The camp director asked if I wanted to speak with someone about payment plans or scholarship options, but I politely declined and suggested they contact Emma's mother directly. Her private school's financial aid office was my final call. I'd been supplementing the tuition payments beyond what the court order required, essentially paying for premium education that the custody agreement didn't mandate. I informed them that future payments would need to come from other sources and provided updated emergency contact information that removed me from the primary responsible party list. By Thursday afternoon, the first wave of consequences had begun. My ex-wife called me 6 times, but I let every call go to voicemail. Her messages progressed from confused to angry to desperate as she realized what was happening. The orthodontist had apparently called about the overdue account and refused to continue treatment without a payment plan. The summer camp had sent a cancellation notice when their payment processing failed. Emma's private school called on Friday morning to discuss the sudden change in payment responsibility. They explained that without the supplemental payments I'd been providing, Emma's account would be significantly past due, and they'd need to discuss alternative arrangements for the upcoming school year. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt as these dominoes fell. Part of me wanted to rush in and fix everything, to be the reliable father who solved problems and made everything okay. But Emma's words kept echoing in my memory, reminding me that I was just her mother's ex-husband, someone who didn't really matter anymore. Update 1. The weekend passed quietly. I turned off my phone and spent 2 days hiking in the state park, trying to clear my head and process what I'd set in motion. When I finally checked my messages Sunday night, I had 17 missed calls from my ex-wife and 3 voicemails from Emma herself. Emma's first message was angry, demanding to know why her braces appointment had been canceled and why the camp had called her mom about payment problems. Her second message was confused, asking why I was being so mean and whether this was about parent-teacher night. Her third message was tears and apologies, begging me to call her back and fix whatever was wrong. I saved those voicemails, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to remember that actions have consequences, and 13-year-olds need to learn that words matter. Emma had made a choice that night in Mrs. Henderson's classroom, and now she was experiencing the reality of that choice. Monday morning brought a desperate text from my ex-wife asking me to call her immediately. She followed up with messages explaining that her husband's income wasn't enough to cover all of Emma's expenses, and they needed to discuss a payment plan. She mentioned that Emma was devastated about the camp cancellation and was begging to talk to me. I waited until Tuesday evening to respond, sending a simple text that I was available for a conversation if she wanted to meet for coffee. She replied within minutes, suggesting a time and place for Wednesday afternoon. I agreed, knowing this conversation would determine the future of my relationship with Emma and my role in her life. Update 2. Wednesday's coffee meeting was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like I'd prepared for. My ex-wife arrived looking like she hadn't slept in days, her usually perfect makeup smudged and her hands shaking as she ordered her latte. She slid into the booth across from me and immediately started crying, which drew stares from other customers and made me acutely uncomfortable. She explained that Emma had been devastated since the weekend, finally understanding that her introduction at parent-teacher night had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Emma apparently spent Monday night sobbing in her room, asking why her real dad was being so mean and whether he still loved her. The irony of that question wasn't lost on me, given that she'd introduced someone else as her real dad just a week earlier. My ex-wife broke down the financial reality they were facing. Her husband's income was stretched thin with his own child support obligations from his previous marriage, and they'd been relying on my voluntary contributions more than they'd realized. The orthodontist was threatening to remove Emma's braces if the account wasn't brought current within 30 days. The summer camp had already given Emma's spot to another child from the waiting list. She begged me to reconsider, explaining that Emma was just a confused teenager who didn't understand the impact of her words. She promised that Emma would apologize and that they'd make sure she understood how much I meant to her. She even offered to increase my custody time if I'd resume the financial support. I listened to everything she said, sipping my coffee and watching her desperation grow. When she finished talking, I asked her one simple question. If Emma's stepfather was her real dad, as Emma had announced to her teacher, why wasn't he handling these financial responsibilities? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. My ex-wife opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly struggling to find an answer that didn't contradict Emma's public declaration. She finally mumbled something about it being complicated and how blended families work differently. I explained my position calmly and clearly. Emma had made her feelings known in a public setting, in front of her teacher and her parents. She'd declared that her stepfather was her real father, and I was just someone who used to be around. If that's genuinely how she felt, then her real father should be providing for her needs, just like real fathers do. My ex-wife tried to argue that Emma didn't mean it the way it sounded, but I stopped her. A 13-year-old girl knows exactly what words like real dad mean, and she chose to use those words deliberately. Emma had wanted to hurt me that night, to diminish my role in her life in front of witnesses, and she'd succeeded completely. I told my ex-wife that I was willing to resume some financial support, but only under specific conditions. Emma needed to publicly acknowledge what she'd done wrong and apologize not just to me, but to Mrs. Henderson for lying during their meeting. She needed to understand that relationships have responsibilities, and if she wanted me to be her father, she needed to treat me like her father. The conversation ended with my ex-wife promising to talk to Emma about my conditions and get back to me within a few days. She left the coffee shop still crying, and I sat there for another hour wondering if I was being too harsh or finally standing up for myself after years of being taken for granted. Update 3. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. I opened the door to find Emma standing in my hallway, looking smaller and younger than her 13 years, with tears streaming down her face and her stepfather's car idling in the parking lot below. She asked if she could come in and talk to me, and despite everything, I couldn't turn her away. Emma sat on my couch and apologized between sobs, explaining that she'd been angry with me about missing her soccer game the previous month and wanted to hurt me the way she thought I'd hurt her. She admitted that she knew her words at parent-teacher night were wrong the moment she said them, but she was too embarrassed to take them back in front of everyone. She explained that her friends at school had been talking about their stepdads, and some of them called their stepfathers their real dads because they lived with them full-time. Emma thought it would make her seem more normal to have a traditional family structure, even if it meant erasing my role in her life temporarily. The conversation was painful and honest. Emma admitted that she'd been taking my support for granted and didn't understand how much I actually did for her family until everything started disappearing. She'd thought the money just magically appeared, not realizing that someone had to work hard to provide for her opportunities. I listened to her apology and felt my heart breaking all over again, but for different reasons this time. This was my little girl, the same child who used to fall asleep on my chest during late-night feedings and who called me daddy until she decided she was too old for baby names. She'd made a mistake, a big one, but she was still my daughter. But I also knew that actions needed consequences, especially for teenagers who were old enough to understand the impact of their words. I explained to Emma that calling someone your real father means they're responsible for your welfare, your expenses, and your future. If she wanted that person to be her stepfather, then he needed to step up to those responsibilities. Emma cried harder and asked if I would ever forgive her and if we could go back to the way things were before. I told her that forgiveness was possible, but trust had to be rebuilt slowly. She'd hurt me deeply, and more importantly, She'd lied to her teacher and manipulated a situation to make herself feel better at my expense. I offered her a path forward. If she wanted me to resume my role as her father, with all the financial and emotional support that entailed, she needed to demonstrate that she valued that relationship. She needed to apologize to Mrs. Henderson for providing false information during their meeting. She needed to acknowledge publicly that she'd been wrong about our family structure. Emma agreed to everything I asked, still crying but nodding vigorously. She promised to call Mrs. Henderson on Monday morning and set up a meeting to correct the record. She said she'd tell anyone who would listen that I was her father, her real father, and that she'd been stupid and wrong. I drove Emma back to her mother's house that evening, and we talked during the 20-minute drive about respect, honesty, and what it means to be family. She asked if I thought her braces treatment could be resumed and whether there might be any spots left at summer camp. I told her those things would depend on how well she followed through on her promises and whether she could prove that our relationship mattered to her. Her stepfather was waiting in the driveway when we arrived, and he actually walked over to thank me for talking with Emma. He admitted that he'd been uncomfortable during the parent-teacher night incident, but hadn't known how to handle the situation. He also acknowledged that he couldn't afford to take on the level of financial support I'd been providing and hoped we could work out an arrangement that was fair to everyone. Update 4. Emma followed through on her promises better than I'd expected. Monday morning, she called Mrs. Henderson's classroom and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. I drove her to school and sat in the hallway while she corrected the record about our family situation. Mrs. Henderson was gracious and understanding, explaining that blended families often create confusion and that Emma's honesty was admirable. Emma apologized for providing misleading information and asked if she could reintroduce me properly as her father. The teacher smiled and said she'd make note of the correct information in Emma's file. Walking out of that school building felt different than it had the previous week. Emma held my hand for the first time in months, and I realized how much I'd missed that simple connection. She asked if we could stop for ice cream on the way home, just like we used to do when she was younger. Over ice cream, Emma brought up the financial consequences of her actions. She'd calculated how much money I'd been spending on her each month and was shocked by the total. She asked if there were ways she could contribute to her own expenses, maybe by getting a part-time job or doing extra chores for spending money. I was impressed by her newfound awareness of our family's financial reality. We talked about age-appropriate ways she could take more responsibility for her expenses and the importance of not taking financial support for granted. She suggested giving up some of her more expensive activities to help reduce the overall burden. The orthodontist appointment was rescheduled for the following week, and I resumed the monthly payments with the understanding that Emma would be more involved in her treatment decisions and costs. The summer camp situation was more complicated, since her spot had been given to another child, but we found a different program that still had openings. Emma's relationship with her stepfather also evolved during this period. She began calling him by his first name instead of Dad, which initially hurt his feelings, but ultimately created clearer boundaries for everyone. He appreciated not having to live up to expectations he wasn't equipped to meet, and Emma stopped trying to force a relationship that had felt artificial. My ex-wife and I had several more conversations about financial responsibilities and co-parenting boundaries. She agreed to take on more of Emma's day-to-day expenses, and her husband committed to helping with specific costs like school supplies and clothing. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it was more balanced and sustainable for everyone involved. Final update. 6 months later, Emma and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. She's never again introduced me as anything other than her father, and she's become more appreciative of the sacrifices I make to support her dreams and activities. The braces came off last month, revealing a beautiful smile that reminded me why all the orthodontic payments had been worth it. Emma's summer camp experience was different than previous years, but she made new friends and gained independence she wouldn't have developed otherwise. Her academic performance improved significantly after we addressed the underlying issues Mrs. Henderson had identified. Emma started seeing a counselor who helped her process her feelings about the divorce and her place in our blended family structure. The therapy sessions were expensive, but they were an investment in Emma's emotional health that paid dividends in our relationship. Emma's stepfather and I developed a cordial working relationship focused on what was best for her rather than protecting our own egos. He handles some of the daily logistics of her care, while I maintain responsibility for major expenses and important decisions. Emma benefits from having multiple adults who care about her welfare, even if our roles are clearly defined. My ex-wife learned to budget more carefully and take on financial responsibilities she'd previously delegated to me. The process was difficult for her, but it ultimately created a more equitable arrangement for everyone involved. She also gained a better understanding of how much I'd been contributing to Emma's life, which improved our co-parenting communication. The most important lesson came from Emma herself, who learned that words have power and consequences that extend far beyond the moment they're spoken. She's become more thoughtful about how she treats people and more appreciative of the relationships that matter most in her life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd simply swallowed my hurt feelings and continued with the status quo after parent-teacher night. Emma might never have learned to value our relationship or understand the sacrifices involved in supporting her lifestyle. She might have continued taking my love and support for granted while publicly diminishing my role in her life. The week that followed parent-teacher night was one of the most difficult periods in my relationship with Emma, but it was also a turning point that forced us both to confront some uncomfortable truths. Emma learned that being a parent involves more than just showing up to school events and soccer games. I learned that sometimes loving someone means allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices, even when it breaks your heart to watch. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's honest and built on mutual respect rather than assumption and obligation. Emma knows that I'm her father not because of biology or legal documents, but because we choose to build and maintain that relationship every day through our words and actions. The teacher who witnessed Emma's introduction that night probably forgot about the incident within a few days. But for Emma and me, that moment became the catalyst for rebuilding our relationship on a stronger foundation. Sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most important growth, and I'm grateful that we found our way back to each other through the confusion and hurt. Emma still calls me Dad, but now she knows what that word really means. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.